Engines in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are a defining characteristic on what makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Unique. The fact that you can play a unique archetype and subset of cards in an entirely different deck means that you can mix things together that you would never dream of. It's something you can't do in other games like Magic, where you'd otherwise be locked behind mana, or a game like One Piece, where your hero's colors will decide what cards you get to play. And because of that, decks that contain multiple archetypes or small engines within a main archetype are very common. Jush will be releasing 3 brand new archetypes with some level of flexibility in all of them. One in particular stands out as a deck that is better used as an engine that may change Yu-Gi-Oh! Permanently, probably for the better. I'm talking, of course, about the K9 cards. K9 is the archetype that people are likely looking forward to the most. It's looking to be the top tier deck once it releases alongside Vanquish Soul to make one deck, a use of 2 engines in one. But for me, the real interest in these K9 cards is not how they work within the confines of a Vanquish Soul deck. In Vanquish Soul, there are extra synergies with the K9 cards. They are a rank 5 XYZ archetype, which works well with Vanquish Soul's 2 level 5 monsters, Jialong and Holly Su. What I'm looking for here is not just that synergy. I'm looking for what K9 could mean for other decks. So I want to highlight in specific the 2 K9 cards that I think will drastically change Yu-Gi-Oh! The first of which is K9 number 17 Izuna, which says if your opponent has 2 or more cards in their hand, you can normal summon this card without tributing. However, this isn't the intended way of playing this card, and we'll see its more practical summoning methods in a second. During the main phase, if your opponent has activated a monster effect in the hand or graveyard this turn, you can, as a quick effect, so that means during other player's turn, special summon this from the hand, and then if this card is normal or special summoned, you can send a K9 card from your deck to the graveyard, except the Izuna. But we have plenty of cards that can summon themselves from the hand during the opponent's turn, like Aegis Orochi, unless they can be converted into a disruption that is meaningless. March Air, for example, the Malice card is not a disruption, it's just an extender. What it sends, however, though, is K9 Double Theta Lupus. I think that's what it's supposed to be, but regardless, during the main phase, if your opponent activated a monster effect in the hand or graveyard this turn, quick effect, summon it from the hand or grave. But banish leaves the field. So this means you get 2 level 5s on the field with the Izuna, because it has the same sort of clause. The opponent uses an effect, it can revive itself. But it doesn't end there, because when this card is summoned, instead of searching again, as you exceed summon using this card you control. You can then overlay for any rank 5, because both are level 5s, obviously. Furthermore, an exceed monster with this card's material does gain the effect that your opponent cannot target it with card effects. That's it. It's these 2 cards I want to highlight on, because you can play a ratio of 3 Izuna and 1 Lupus in effectively anything, without any further synergies from other K9 cards. While Vanquish Soul decks will play a large suite of them, this package of 4 could be played in the new decks. It could be played in Draco Tail, it could be played in Yummy, it could be played in Malice. Now, why does this matter? Well, yeah, getting to make a rank 5 on the opponent's turn has obvious beneficial implications. You can make cards like Artifact Durendal or the new K9 Ripper, which negates graveyard and hand effects. This will serve to give you some much needed disruption, but to me, what's actually important here is a different set of rank 5s. It can make Nash Knight, or the new Valen, the Sky Psy Blaster. I think I messed that up, but it's fine. What do those cards do? Well, Valen is a quick effect to attach 1 to try to face a monster in the field and set it face down. Upon going to the grave, it can destroy a set card, but that's not the important part. The biggest thing here is quick effect, Pokemon. The alternative, Nash Knight, is like Silent Honor Arc. It can attach 2 materials to steal an opponent's monster, attach its material, and then you place a 101 through 107 monster as material to the Nash Knight. It is like Honor Arc, but it doesn't need attack position, as well as it can be during either player's turn importantly. Both of these are forms of removal, and that's not necessarily commonplace in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, especially as disruption goes from the hand. As far as removing bodies from the field, if you wanted to do that in hand trap form, you really only had Nibiru the Primal Being to do so. Outside of that, you have to go really far to accomplish that. Say you wanted to destroy a monster with Dominus Impulse or Purge, you needed the setup already having a trap in the grave. And within the context of your turn 1 or your opponent's turn 1, that meant drawing pretty specific combinations. The closest thing we get to removal in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! From hand traps is Fire King Kirin. That's also not a single card combo. It requires multiple working pieces together And when that happens, it means you have to play a deck fully dedicated towards that engine. So Fire King sometimes will pop off in your opponent's turn 0. It doesn't happen that often, and it's not reliable as a sub-archetype to a more dominant strategy. And then lastly, there's Ghost Ogre, a card which I've gone on the record plenty of times to saying I think is really not that good of a card. And it largely stems from the fact that if you're just destroying a card that's already used its effect, if the effect still resolves, the Ogre oftentimes doesn't suffice. Ogre only really lives up to the standards of being a good card when it negates and destroys. So when you would chain it to an Appaloosa, to a Summon Sorceress, to a Pendulum Monster, it would destroy those cards, and then because they need to stay face up to resolve, it would also negate them. When Ogre does that, it's a good card, but it's a lot more situational and conditional to its environment in order for it to be playable. So if this doesn't all click for you, let me give you some examples on why removal hand traps are such a key thing in combating these broken go first decks. Take Snake Eyes, for example, or any one of its iterations. If your opponent's using hand and graveyard effects, you can use your Canine cards to make any rank 5, right? And that'll happen almost immediately with any deck. Poplar's hand effect, Poplar's graveyard effect, Fiendsmith hand effect, Fiendsmith graveyard effect. Essentially, from the first action, you'll be able to use Canine, which means that you'll now have several different junction points to use one of your disruptions to make a rank 5 that your opponent hopefully cannot deal with. Now, in the context of Snake Eye, we have a couple options. We could wait for opponent to summon, say, Moon of the Closed Sky. If we wait till they do that to summon our Nash Knight and steal the Moon, we could potentially cut off altogether Fiendsmith access. What if we don't have Fiendsmith cards? What if we want a more complete stop to them? Or we already have an answer to the Fiendsmith, say a Bestial. Well, you can then use your Nash Knight to suck up the Flameburge. Or if you want to book it, you can make Valen and book the Flameburge while keeping your monster untargetable. Either way, it requires them to commit even more resources to solve the problem, and all of which could mean the deck is just forced to adapt to a lower ceiling, and overall the end board drops pretty drastically. It does apply even to more modern combo decks. Take December's iteration of Malice, a very bestial heavy version, without some of the newer Ignister extenders, which albeit are kind of busted and hard to interact with. If your opponent starts with a Malice monster and then is a bestial with Link Decoder, it was often essentially impossible to interact with. There was just nothing you could do. Effect Veiler Imperm did nothing. You can't Ashred Ransom because they chain block it. You'd have no recourse whatsoever. Your best option is like Bell a Bestial in hand, and that's terrible because the second Bestial you lose. But again, here, the Canine cards would make that Bestial now an actual risk. It would give you a real counterplay to the Bestial cards. All this means that historically, Yu-Gi-Oh! Doesn't have much removal when you go second. And decks that thrive against negation but not against removal become really strong when you go first. And I think a deck like Malice is a prime example of that. The fact that an Ash Blossom against Malice can sometimes just do literally nothing should kind of signal how little that type of negation will do against them. But if you have removal against Malice, and say you go first and set Book of Moon and pass, there's a fair bit of hands that just beats them. So the fact that this new Canine package exists, Azuna and Lupus, is monumental for Yu-Gi-Oh! It shows a shift in card design that we really haven't seen in some time, that's going to allow players to interact with removal on the opponent's first turn. And I do think this is incredibly important for the game to keep up with power balance, because as decks get stronger, we need more ways and stronger tools to combat them. Otherwise, the game becomes a complete coin flip, which is something we've been scared of happening for quite some time now. And there's been stretches in Yu-Gi-Oh's recent history where we haven't got any new hand traps to keep up with the arms race for months or sets on end. And I think specifically after the release of, say, Nibiru and the Tins, we had a stretch there where there wasn't much in terms of hand traps. Eventually we got Bestials, and those helped versus some decks. In modern times, they have released new cards to combat combos. We've seen the Charmies and the Dominus cards. I'm very happy to see that Konami's realized if they're going to have combos get better, the arms race with Disruption needs to improve as well. But where the Dominus cards and Charmies are nice to have, they still, yes, left this sort of hole in the game of you only had kind of one or two ways to interact with the opponent. Floodgate them or negate. No removal. And I don't like that you remove that aspect of interaction in the game, because that's a big part of Yu-Gi-Oh! I'm curious to see if they will do more than just this one package for the near future. I know at the time of recording this, they already announced another new Dominus card that is not out in any Yu-Gi-Oh format yet. A new Dominus trap card that does act as removal. It does have some conditions attached to it that make it kind of sus if it's worth playing. The point is, it seems Konami has finally made themselves open to the fact that a removal hand trap is the place you need to be at. It'll hopefully keep some of these combo decks in check. And part of the theory behind that is when there's enough diversity in different types of hand traps out there and you can consistently play against them, it'll deter people from playing decks that just straight up lose to them. And it'll force you to play a more lower to the ground mid-range deck that feels more in line with Yu-Gi-Oh's core values because it's not going to auto lose to anything. It's going to engage in longer, more well thought out game plans. And that's arguably what Vanquish Soul is trying to accomplish, right? Because both players play during either player's turn, and you get a lot of interaction between them, and Vanquish Soul cards are hard to interact with. They don't have any one sort of bombshell that defeats them. Now, we could say that's not enough yet, and they still don't have enough good tools going second for other decks to thrive. In fact, Vanquish Soul has that advantage in the fact that it has Holisu to up that number of removal hand traps even further. But if that's where Yu-Gi-Oh's heading, I think I'm kind of down for it. Now, this does mean that to some extent we're heading towards this play during turn 0 aspect even more, both players, more akin to what we saw in Tier. And everyone may not like that. This doesn't mean everything will be a Tier carbon copy, it just means that interaction will start from the get-go from both players. There's no sitting back and relaxing. And personally, I think that's a fine thing. Now, a couple other things I wanted to know with these cool canine cards. For one, it's that Lupus can actually exceed summon with itself. So that means if a deck is ever weak to Typhon and doesn't have a way of preventing Lupus, then Lupus can convert into Typhon, which I think is interesting because an untargetable Typhon is a floodgate of sorts, which you can argue is kind of sketch, but is a valuable resource to stopping certain decks. For example, if I'm playing against Rizal and for some reason they don't have a detonator live, if I make Typhon, any future detonator, or even if I'm playing the Mitsu cards, Amenim or Akamo, are now unusable. The Typhon can then be disruption to bounce cards, or I could attack and make a Zeus with it. And remember, because of Lupus's effect, it's untargetable, the Typhon or the Zeus. And that's pretty darn useful to note when we're approaching how to use these canine cards the most value. While this is also a huge step towards what I consider an ideal Yu-Gi-Oh, it also needs to be said that we have had this sort of 3-1 package before. If you recall, the Psyframe cards were almost exactly this, and they did provide a form of removal alongside negation, and they were absolutely integral to going second in a lot of matchups. Now, I've voiced my opinion on this before, but I always thought those cards were incredibly good for the game. Ironically, with the comparison between Gamma and the Canine cards, how Gamma was most broken when it goes first, you could argue that Canine cards do have a similar sort of problem, and it's something I wish didn't exist, although it is a big fear amongst removal-based hand traps. And that is, when you go first with the Canine cards, they actually perform pretty well as extenders, because they don't require it to be your opponent's turn. So if your opponent hand traps you, you can summon Azuna and then summon a negation-based rank 5, which will then propel you further through hand traps. Or you could just use it to make link fodder, but I think the one that is scary to me is it does act in that Gamma-like faction to push your combos forward, and that one concerns me. Yes, it was broken if you resolved Gamma when you went first, but you could largely play around that, and when you went second, it was a very important tool to staying alive. I liked those cards existed, but Konami did deem them too powerful, and obviously we know that they're at 1 and a 1 each, or Driver's at a 1, but Gamma's at 1. And thus the engine is sort of faded into obscurity as it's not worth the brick to payoff ratio. I would like to see that change reverted. I'd like to see them lean back into this removal centric sort of stance, but there's always a chance Konami does the opposite, and we see them say, okay, yeah, it's too broken, and put Izuna to 1, leaving us with the same 1-1 ratio that we have with the Psyframe cards. I think if I had to redesign these cards, I would rather design them in a way where either they locked you into something if you did them during your own turn, but not during the opponent's turn. Or maybe, I guess if you locked you in the opponent's turn, that's fine. Let's say you locked you in a rank 5s. That would be good, because if you're not playing a rank 5 or a K9 deck specifically, if you want to use it during your own turn, it's not really beneficial unless that's the last thing you do. But if you want to use it as disruption, unless you plan on summoning more cards in your opponent's first turn, it's not a huge deal. Lastly, I want to kind of circle back to the point that Yu-Gi-Oh! Metagames will reshape and evolve around the disruptions that exist, oftentimes from the hand. We've already seen that to some degree with the Charmies cards that draw in the past, but even with K9 cards, I think we'll see that almost immediately. So K9 does have a clear condition weakness. Like Nibiru, it needs a requirement before you can use it. Not 5 summons, in this case it's hand or graveyard effects. So the way of approaching against K9 is different than approaching Nibiru. Against K9, you want to play a deck, if you can, that doesn't use that many hand or graveyard effects, unless it can push through the K9 cards reliably. And because of this fact is a large reason we see Yummy taking off in Japan. And it's likely it'll do the same here. It is, ironically, within the same set, cats and dogs against each other, it's the natural enemy to K9 cards. It kind of goes to show how these hand traps can shape the format around them. Now, if we have enough hand traps with enough conditions around them, you create a format where these high-power combo decks have no escape. No matter which path they go through, they play into Nibiru, they play into Azuna, or some other mysterious hand trap, to the point where you can't make these risky calls and you have to go with the safer option. And this is where the more removal hand traps will come into play, and why Azuna itself may not be enough just yet, even if it is still a huge difference. Now, in the current format, because of the fact that K9 cards interact weirdly against K9 cards, that Yummy will be decently popular, there's a chance that we don't see non-Vanquish Soul decks main deck K9. That doesn't mean, though, that it can't be involved in side decks, or that it won't be important in the future. I think the K9 cards are a huge step in Yu-Gi-Oh's card design. I love the fact that they're re-embracing the ability to mix engines together, and I also low-key love that Lupus itself, while the brick in the archetype, isn't as useless as, say, a card like Cyframe Driver. It's a big change in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because otherwise, with each set, it feels like it's releasing more of the same cards, just reskinned with a slightly different gimmick, but not a drastic different approach to the game. This, however, is fairly different. I'm excited to see how it shapes up, if more things come of it, and hopefully we'll all be enjoying Yu-Gi-Oh! For many years to come. But I want to hear from you guys. Let me know what you think. Do you think the K9 cards are as big of a deal as I think they are? Do you think this engine will see success outside of the Vanquish Soul or larger K9 packages? Do you think that this is even good? I'm here to share your thoughts, and with that, I'll see you all next time. Have a good one, guys.